The fork on your table is so ordinary that you probably do not notice it until one is missing. But for a long time, this little piece of metal had a reputation problem. In parts of Europe, the fork looked unnecessary. It looked foreign. It looked like a tool for people who were too delicate to touch their own food. And that is the strange part of the story. The fork did not become normal because people suddenly discovered points could pick things up. It became normal because the dinner table itself changed. Before the personal table fork, people were not simply eating like chaos. A meal had tools. There were knives, there were spoons, there was bread, there were serving forks in kitchens and on carving tables. But at the table, the human hand still did a lot of work. That was not automatically rude. If everyone accepted the same rules, fingers were part of the system. Then the small personal fork arrived, especially through elite and Italian dining culture. Suddenly, one person at the table had a new message in their hand. Please do not touch the shared dish. That message could sound polite. It could also sound like an insult. A surviving 15th century Italian fork in the Metropolitan Museum of Art is a perfect clue. It is not a big kitchen tool. It is a careful table object, narrow, personal, almost jewelry-like. To modern eyes, it looks civilized. To many older diners, that was exactly the problem. There were stories about delicate Eastern or Byzantine habits. There were jokes about luxury. There was suspicion that the fork was a foreign affectation, a tiny symbol of people making dinner more complicated than it needed to be. And then, in the early 1600s, an English traveller named Thomas Coryat saw forks used in Italy and wrote about them. His description is wonderfully practical. Italians, he said, used a little fork while cutting meat. If someone touched a shared dish with fingers, the company could take offence. The reason was simple. Not every person's fingers were equally clean. That is the whole fork revolution in one sentence. The fork was not just a tool, it was a boundary. It turned a shared dish into a set of invisible personal zones. It changed what counted as clean. It changed what counted as refined. It changed what counted as embarrassing. Coryat brought the habit home, and he says he was mocked for it. A friend called him a fork bearer, basically teasing him for being the kind of person who needed a fork at dinner. Imagine that now. You sit down, pick up a fork, and the whole table laughs because you are being too fancy. That laughter tells us why everyday objects can take so long to win. The hard part is not always the invention. The hard part is asking people to change what feels normal. Over time, the fork got help from fashion, courtly manners, cleaner dining habits, and better metalwork. 2 long tines became 3, then 4. The fork became better at holding food, not just spearing it. Place settings became more individual. Plates replaced more shared eating. Manners became a performance of self-control. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the table fork was no longer a scandalous foreign trick. It was part of the script. Knife on one side, fork on the other. Hands mostly out of the food. The same object that once seemed ridiculous became the object that told everyone you knew how to behave. That is why the fork is more interesting than it looks. It not just moved food from plate to mouth. It moved the dinner table from shared touch toward personal space. So the next time you pick up a fork, remember, you are holding a tiny piece of social technology, a tool that had to survive suspicion, jokes, and centuries of habit before it became invisible.